Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome back to the Graduate Gamer Podcast, the show where I sit down and have a good old chinwag with people from all over the hobby sphere. I'm your host, Michael, and today I'm joined by the founder of Fragging Unicorns, Opti. Hey, Opti, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem, it's a pleasure. So, before we get too deep into all the hobby talk, for those people out there who've never heard of Fragging Unicorns, why don't you let them know what you guys do and, what you've got coming up?
Awesome. Fragging Unicorns Games is a brand new gaming company. We were started last year, and our first game is Gangs of the Undercity, which is a miniature skirmish war game. You control a cyberpunk fantasy gang brawling in the Undercity of Neo Babylon. So that Kickstarter goes live on July 15th, and so yeah, that'll be our first offering.
Awesome stuff. So I noticed you said your first game there, so a more planned for future?
Absolutely. The first thing we have after Games of the Undercity that's actually in concurrent development is a role playing game that is set in the same universe as Gangs of the Undercity. That's going to be called Subversion. And that's also going to be a sort of cyberpunk fantasy role playing game. We
Oh,
have
nice one.
plans for others, but we want to start small, make sure we can deliver before we get too far ahead of ourselves.
Nice one. So let's get into the point of this podcast, which is hobby. So if I were to enter your world of hobby right now, what would I find sat on your project table?
Everything on my table right now is Gangs of the Undercity stuff. I've been doing a lot of painting of Gangs of the Undercity minis. I've been putting together terrain and learning different techniques for painting terrain because that's not been my traditional strong suit. But due to a number of factors, which is an interesting story that I wouldn't mind telling, we weren't able to get the terrain quick enough to get it to a professional painter. So it's up to me to do my best to paint up terrain and to take the pictures for the Kickstarter, which has added a little bit to my stress load, but that's okay. The pandemic and whatnot is making everything just a little bit too slow for our timeline. So.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yep, so go ahead. How come you ended up with getting the terrain late?
Okay, so again, some of it is just pandemic related stuff, right? Just everything is slow,
Mm-hmm.
but we had a terrain maker that we were working with, for a number of months, and we had worked together on getting some pieces out, and they had sent me some designs and some prototypes and whatnot. And right as we were about to take it to the next level, um, their company went out of business due to coronavirus related stuff.
Oh,
And so we say, "I'm sorry to do this to you." You know, we're like 2 or 3 months out from the Kickstarter. He's like, "Sorry to do this to you, but I won't be able to do the terrain." I was like, "No! Oh my god, what are we gonna do?" So I ran around like crazy, asking everybody, like, "Hey, like, who do you think I should reach out to?" And somebody said, Death Ray Designs, and I'd already seen Death Ray Designs. I was an admirer of their stuff, but the last time I went to their website, um, their checkout was in pounds, and so I just assumed maybe my settings were off, but I assumed that they were UK based, and so I
mm-hmm.
said, "No, I don't have time for that." I don't have time to go back and forth with a UK base just because of communications and then shipping and all that. And so somebody, I was talking with somebody else, and they said, no, they're based in North Carolina. And I said, really? So I went back and I reached out to them, and I said, here's the situation. We have this Kickstarter coming up. Our terrain guy backed out. What are the chances that you would be able to work with me and to get some prototype stuff up real quick? And after that, like, they were just super super great. I mean, like, immediately within the first week they said, sure, we'll do that. And, like, here, have some prototypes. We worked on these on the weekend, and they've produced some really amazing terrain for us, in their modular system, uh, that also works with everything else that they've produced, like for Infinity and just normal futuristic city terrain. So we were super stoked and really, I guess, just super lucky that they were so willing to jump on and work with us. But again, the fact is that even as quick as they worked, still wasn't quite able to get the terrain in time to get it out to a professional and have that back to me in time for the Kickstarter.
Yeah. And it certainly does look like some wonderful stuff. I'm especially liking the look of the I forget the name, but the terminals, like they're looking particularly nice, and I'm looking forward to getting some of those.
Yeah. I'm still painting up my Cyberlinks, but the way they designed them, that was the first thing they designed. And they said, hey, what if we did this thing where we made them just big enough for you to stick in like an LED light? And, we had this little thing you can open up in the back and just stick an LED light in. And when you close it, like the acrylic part of the front glows in whatever color. So like that was really, really cool. So I'm super excited to get one of those up and running to show off.
Yeah, it's certainly always nice to have some LEDs to go with your cyberpunk terrain.
Absolutely.
Um, so if we take it back all the way to the beginning, how did you actually first end up getting involved with kind of the world of miniatures and role play and just general hobby, I guess?
Sure. Um, those two things are intertwined quite a bit. So I'll go way all the way back to the beginning, and just say that I was a really, really nerdy kid,
Hmm.
like made fun of on the playground type nerdy kid. uh, and I had like just a couple of friends that I didn't know were nerdy like I was, but I discovered that they were. This is in third grade, and we were at recess. Do they call it recess in the UK? You guys have a word
I think break time is what it tends to go
break
by.
time? Sure, yeah. So we're at break time, and I see a couple of my friends, and they're all hunched around like in a corner, like up with their backs up against the wall, and they're hunched over something, and I couldn't see what it was. So I was like, "What are you guys doing?" And I got closer, and I saw they all had books, and they were like rolling like weird looking dice in the middle of them. And I was like, "What are you guys doing?" They said, "We're playing Dungeons and Dragons." I was like, "What's Dungeons and Dragons?" And that sounds awesome. And they were like, "Okay, you want to play?" And I was like, "Sure." So I played for maybe like 5 minutes until break time was over. I went back home. I said, "Mom, you got to get me some Dungeons and Dragons stuff." So she went and bought me a bunch of the books, and of course, I didn't know the difference between basic Dungeons and Dragons and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So
Yeah.
all of my stuff was like this mix of both. But then I went back the next day, and they're like, "No, we're done playing. We're not going to play anymore." So basically, I had all these books and just ate them up and just read ravenously as much as I could, and tried to get the people on my block to play. But what ended up happening is most of the time we just ended up making characters over and over and over again because none of us wanted to be the DM.
Yeah.
But I did eventually find folks to play with, and then we got into high school, and it became sort of, again, a nerdy thing to do. And so I played only in safe spaces. We would go on to weekends and spend the night, at each other's houses and play that kind of stuff. But then it was back to like pretending we were jocks and cool kids throughout the week.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until my undergrad that I got back into anything nerdy. And that was when I got into Warhammer. I had a number of folks who I was friends with, and they said, "Hey, have you ever played Warhammer?" And I was like, "No, I haven't played Warhammer. What's that like?" Look, and they took me to a hobby shop, and I went, "Oh my god, this is like Dungeons and Dragons with figures." And so I got way into it. Got into as much as I could actually with the limited amount of money I had. But then I got a real job, and of course exploded. And chaos was my jam. I had a huge chaos army, I still do. Lots of beast men, lots of demons. I was in that hobby. I was in a Warhammer hobby for geez, I don't know, 15 and more years. Just all the time playing
Yeah.
every Friday with my buddies, and every time I could get a chance, going to Adepticon, and doing the whole hobbyist and the painting thing, and just that was a huge part of my life. And along that same time, I had some buddies who started playing Dungeon Dragons at grad school by this time, and they were just talking about it in class. And I said, "Are you guys talking about Dungeon Dragons?" Said, "Yeah, we're going to start tonight." I said, "Dude, can I come play Dungeon Dragons with you?" I hadn't played Dungeon Dragons in 10 years by that point. And so they brought me in, and we had a campaign that lasted, a number of years. But when that campaign was finished, I said, "Hey, could I try my hand at being a GM, I'd like to play Shadowrun, right?
Yeah.
So we transitioned the game into Shadowrun, and that started off a whole other part of the career for me, where I actually got involved in the gaming industry. But the whole time, I was also still, playing war games and Warhammer specifically. We also got into a couple of games on the side, like Free Blades and 40K and everything. But Warhammer Fantasy, Wartime was my jam.
Hmm.
Until you can see where this is going. I was a huge Warhammer Fantasy player until Games Workshop decided to go nuclear on the entire world of Warhammer Fantasy, and it broke my heart so much that I kind of had to put Warhammer on the shelf for a bit. But that was okay, because right as Games Workshop was blowing up my favorite fantasy universe, Shadowrun announced that it was going to be making a skirmish war game based in its universe called Sprawlgangers. And so I thought, that's okay. I can put away my Warhammer, and I still just have a garage full of Warhammer that I can't wait to break out again one day. I hear good things on the horizon about Warhammer Fantasy, so I'm hoping against hope that I'm going to enjoy whatever comes next. But I thought I'll just get into Sprawlgangers thing, and that will tide me over. That will take up my hobby time. But then over time, it became pretty clear that Sprawlgangers was never going to happen. And then I gradually, just focused less and less on my wargaming and more on the role-playing game side of my hobby, where I also began to, have other business ventures, like writing RPGs, became part of something that was my job, and doing podcasts about Shadowrun was also something that I was doing. So it all kind of blended together, and then it's now come around full circle.
Yeah. Was it always kind of like, somewhat of a dream of yours to work in this sort of industry, or had you always kind of thought you'd be working somewhere else for your life, and it would just always be kind of something to do on the weekends or something to play with your mates when you got some free time?
Yeah, I actually never considered working in the RPG industry. It's like those kind of things where, like, that somebody does them, but you don't really know how that happened for them, and it doesn't really ever seem like a career path that you yourself could follow. It didn't occur to me that that's something that you could do, until again I started a podcast about the history, the lore of the Shadowrun universe, and that went so well that it accidentally got me some contacts in the RPG industry. And so I was at one of the American conventions called Origins Game Fair, and I happened to get an introduction to the line developer of Shadowrun, Jason Hardy, and I shoved my portfolio at him. I said, "Hey, apparently people can write for you. Like, here's my resume." And he like kind of looked at it and like said, like, "I'm really too busy for this right now, but I'll take a look later." So I emailed him my portfolio, and he didn't get back to me. And then I followed up the next week, and the next week, and the next week. This went on for like 3 months, and he finally said, like, "Okay, fine, you're in. Come write for me." I said, "Great." And that's kind of how it started. It was just never something that I thought I would be able to do. But then as I wrote more and more, I got asked to write for another RPG called Earth Dawn. I got asked to write for another RPG that's coming out called Purgatory, like a Weird West type thing. And the more that I spent time in the industry and just listened to freelancers and artists and just people working in the RPG and gaming industry, it became pretty clear that there's a lot of taking advantage of people that goes on. The margins seem pretty thin, and so like trying to pay your freelancers as little as possible and kind of get them on the worst possible terms seems to be like industry standard. And I kept struggling, and I don't know, are you familiar with Shadowrun at all?
Yes.
Okay, good. Shadowrun at its heart is about like, fighting the system right? It's
Yeah.
about these corporate overlords that are doing awful crap, and your character gets to be someone who does something about it for good or ill. And I just kept thinking to myself, like, we're writing these stories about fighting back against the system, and everybody is falling over themselves to act just like the system. Like, and I that just it's after a while, like, it's not just, it wasn't Shadowrun or Catalyst Game Labs themselves necessarily that were doing the bulk of that. It was just the entire industry
Yeah.
that just seemed to not care too much about the individual people that it's churning through. So I had new people that had been freelancers, just brilliant, amazingly talented writers who got burned out in the industry just because they were being treated so badly. And there's this attitude among a lot of people in the industry. And if I'm peeling back too much, and if I'm revealing how the sausage is made, and that's not desirable, please just cut this part out to save whatever face.
That's fine.
I don't have any. I'm not burning any bridges, but neither am I particularly interested in like telling half truths. So yeah, I saw these guys get burned out because the industry treats people as if like, hey, we are the stuff that you like, and we're your childhood, and we're the cool stuff. So it is a privilege for you, you fan nerd, to work for us. And that's sort of how people are treated, and so they can, you know, delay your pay or pay you, you know, so little, or change your work without permission, all kind of stuff that like you can get away with because you're treating people like they are, I don't know, replaceable cogs as opposed to, you know, real people and real talented
Yeah.
people. I just thought, you know, and that's the reason that Fragging Unicorns came about. I just got so tired of just being a cog in that, in that community that tries really hard to be an industry. That I thought, you know, we can do this better. Like, maybe not do it more efficiently, and maybe not do it like to an amazing level of over the top quality right away. But I know for a fact that if we started our own company, we can be more ethical than everybody else. We can treat people well. We can do what we would want in their shoes, and that has been the biggest challenge that we've had so far at Fragging Unicorns Games, is just trying to be as good as we would want people to be to us, and it is super hard to do in this industry.
Yeah. So I imagine, with your desire to help make Fragging Unicorns kind of stand out, as you can say, and not act like the rest of the industry, you've kind of been able to work with some quite talented people in regards to both the current project, Gangs of the Undercity, and games that you have planned for the future.
Yeah. So part of the struggle with doing things the way that we're doing them is that we don't have huge investments, right? We don't want to be beholden to anybody who
Mm-hmm.
dumped a bunch of money on us, and now we kind of feel like we owe them to do X, Y, and Z. So everything that we're doing is volunteer. Everything that we're doing is personal investments, right? So if we need to pay somebody, that money is coming from my pocket initially or upfront, not from any other loans or
Yeah.
investments. So we have a good amount of money sunk in to Gangs of the Undercity and to Fragging Unicorns games, but also when we reach out to freelancers, and I should say that also means that we don't have staff. It also means that we, until we start making money, we won't be able to have anybody full time on staff that does this, as their job. I'd love to hire. We have some sculptors. I'd love to hire some artists. I'd love to have in house,
Mm-hmm.
layout folks. But that stuff all requires money, and until we see how this Kickstarter is going to go, we really don't have the ability to have people in house yet. But it means that we have to go out to freelancers and reach out and say, hey, we're doing this project. What do you think? Here's the designs. And one of the first we got was Kieran Russell, who has done a number of Kickstarter games and board games like Folklore, The Affliction, and I can't remember the other ones off the top of my head. But yeah, he was one of the first people that we reached out to, and I learned a bunch of techniques in the industry for lowballing people and for trying to get freelancers to work for less, and we just disagreed about that. And so I said, Kieran, what do you want to get paid for this, and what are the timetables that are comfortable for you?
Hmm.
And he gave me that number, and I said, okay, that's what we have to meet. And so we worked towards getting that done. And I offered to Kieran, I also offered to all of our artists that we have, and writers. I said, I can give you whatever freelance rate you think is best, um, or I can give you a percentage of the profit that comes from the game itself once it's been sold. And some people take me up on that, and some people just want the basic freelancer rate. But either way, they get to choose. Right? I'm not going to try to make money off of the backs of other people's work if I'm not putting work in myself. So everybody who wants a freelance rate gets their freelance rate. They get 50% upfront, and then they get 50% once they turn in their work, which is unheard of in the industry. Everybody also gets a chance to say, I don't want to get paid. I want a piece of the profit so they can continue to benefit. So yeah,
Hmm.
it's it's again, and we have people who like, for example, when we were figuring out what our world was going to be like, and our world is set basically in our world, the Earth as we know it, uh, but with some pretty significant historical differences. And as we were
Yeah.
trying to figure out what our version of these countries would look like, we decided, it's probably not okay to have. I'm a ruddy-haired, white middle-class dude. So it's probably not best for me to go run around and tell people, what China or what Africa or what the Americas are going to be like.
Hmm.
So we had to run out, and we grabbed, we sent out messages saying, hey, any indigenous folks or anybody who can authentically do some world building for us, if you're from this region or if you're from this culture, we want you. And so hiring different people from different cultures to work on their own culture in our world, that also costs money, right? So, like, again, just doing things ethically, doing things the way that we would want them to be done, it absolutely has a cost. um, but we, again, just decided that if we're going to try this, we have to upfront be the best that we can with the resources that we have. And if we
Yeah.
don't have the resources, then we just won't do it, and we'll kind of kick that can down the road. But so far, it's worked out, and we're pretty excited about the results.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like this game is very much a kind of big passion project, and no, I mean, I've one certainly hope it takes off because it does look. I mean, I've loved the look of the models. I've loved kind of the aesthetic. Cyberpunk for me is something I've always kind of wanted a skirmish game of
Mm-hmm.
because like I'm a big fan of Necromunda. I'm a big fan of these sort of campaign narrative driven games,
Absolutely,
and I
yeah.
remember um, so my experience with Shadowrun is more so the PC games
Oh yeah,
over the RPG system, but I did briefly run a short campaign in the RPG system. But Cyberpunk has always kind of been one of those, I guess, hidden loves of mine. Of there's not really much out there video game wise for it. There's not really much out there kind of miniature wise for it. So it's been really kind of nice to see that someone's actually kind of tackling this sort of interest, and it's very much, as far as I'm aware, there aren't any other games set in the kind of cyberpunk universe that involve miniatures and gangs and that sort of stuff currently.
There are a few other sort of cyberpunk esque things out there, but yeah, we're trying to fill a niche that is blowing up at the moment. 2020 is definitely a cyberpunk year, especially with the new Cyberpunk 2077 coming out.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And yeah, it is definitely a passion project. Um, one of the one of the things behind the scenes that we keep telling ourselves is, um, if these big corporations, I say big corporations, they're not actually that big, but RPG gaming industry, like if they've been promising something like this for a number of years, and they keep giving excuses as far as, oh, distributing, and oh, can't get the minis right, and oh, blah blah blah. I just
Hmm.
thought, like, if I do it with no budget, and having this huge learning curve of everything from getting box art made to getting the boxes made to getting tokens made to getting concept art uh, to sculpts to manufacturing minis. If I can do this with no budget and no staff in a year, then I think that will, I don't know what I want exactly to say about that,
Hmm.
but I guess I just want to say, like, if I can do it, surely, you can do this. Surely, the bigger companies can not only treat people right, but also they can stop giving excuses for why they can't do things in the first place that they say they want to do.
Yeah, and I think be kind of a good time to go into how did kind of Gangs of the Undercity itself become a thing? Like, how did you settle on the concept of cyberpunk, and kind of what went into the initial decisions that eventually became Gangs of the Undercity?
Well, again, it kind of goes back to the the Sprawl Gangers that was supposed to come out in the Shadowrun universe.
Hmm.
We'd go to conventions every year, and they would have the demo agents, all gathered together, and they would kind of give like a what's going on, with Shadowrun or what's going on with Catalyst. Every year, they recorded them sometimes, and every year you could hear one voice in the back asking the question, "But what about Sprawl Gangers?" And that was always me. Like I always wanted to know, like, "Hey, this game's still happening, right?" I sort of put my Warhammer in the garage for this game, and I really need some hobby. Um, and every year it's just kind of, well, we'll still looking around in the minis and blah 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 excuses and things like that. And they might be valid excuses. I don't know. Like they have other games that have come out and they're amazing games. So I don't want to bash Catalyst at all, especially since they still pay me some for writing. But last year, maybe it was the year before. Yeah, I guess they didn't have it this year. So the year before, um, we were sitting there and they had released a 5-pack of Shadowrun miniatures, and I got a chance to look at them, and the scale was off. They were maybe like 40 millimeter scale,
Yeah.
um, and the plastic was just not great. It was kind of like a wilty soft plastic, and the detail was not great. Like so, it wasn't a painting miniature. It was just a sort of display type miniature, I guess. Nothing that you would play a game with.
Yeah.
And so I said, hey, these minis come out. Like, what about Sprawl Gangers? That is my question every year. And they said, well, if these minis sell enough, and if sorry, that was my text message. If these minis sell well enough, then maybe we'll get another set of these minis released. And if those sell well enough, then maybe we'll release some maps or something like this. And then if those sell well enough, maybe we'll think about Sprawl Gangers. And that was when I knew, like, you know what, Sprawl Gangers is never going to happen.
Yeah.
Like this, it's clear that they aren't moving on this with any sense of urgency. And my friends and I had been talking about this. Well, like, what's stopping us from doing this? Like, and once we got over the hurdle that, like, Shadowrun does not have any sort of claim or monopoly on mixing Shadowrun or mixing cyberpunk and fantasy together, we just said, like, why not? Like, why not make the game that we have wanted to play for so long?
Hmm.
And initially, I kept thinking to myself, what if I just write this? What if I get this together, show them it can be done, and then maybe I'll just sell it to them, and they can just sort of, it'll be like a turnkey thing. Just go ahead and push the button. And I have no doubt that if Catalyst took our game and said, "Hey, this is Shadowrun," then it would do fantastically well, and crush all the goals that we have for it.
Yeah.
But they have other plans. They're going in a different direction, and so our game, the sort of wargamer focused version of cyberpunk fantasy gangs, is where we decided to focus. Just putting out the game that we wanted to play. And I will say that a lot of guys on the team are much more excited about the role playing game that we have coming out. But we decided to do what we felt was going to be the hardest thing first.
Hmm.
And definitely producing a miniatures game is the hardest possible thing we could have done. We could have made a board game much easier. We could have made a role playing game much easier. But the miniatures themselves having to be the quality that they are, for hobbyists to enjoy, and also to balance a game that's a lot more crunchy and less narrative than an RPG, has just been an incredibly steep hill. but we have been able to climb it, and I'm super impressed with all of my team and what we've been able to do with the limited budget, the limited time, and the limited staff.
Yeah, I imagine as well. It gives the nice thing of when the RPG game does come out, if they're the kind of people that want to use miniatures for their game, well, then they have this entire range for Gangs of the Undercity that they can turn to, and they don't have to kind of go to third parties. They can get miniatures that are kind of built for this specific game with the correct kind of gear and the correct kind of themes, and they can help bring their games to life more than they would be if it was just, here's a character sheet, here's pen and paper, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the also benefit of having art assets to work with, and knowing, layout people that we have made in this process, and knowing printing people and publishing people. So yeah, the process of making the RPG is going to seem like incredibly easy compared to what we've been dealing with the last year. So again, we're excited about it. That's in concurrent development too. So the timeline is actually much easier for the RPG. So yeah, we're pretty excited about it.
Good. So you've mentioned kind of quite a lot about how Gangs of the Undercity is cyberpunk, and kind of skirmish game, kind of similar to Necromunda and that sort of stuff. But what would you say makes Gangs of the Undercity stand out from these other skirmish games?
In particular, there's two big things I think that stand out, and the first is we have a level of customization of your gang that games like Necromunda don't offer, right? So Necromunda, you pick, your kind of gang. Yeah, I guess it's gang. You pick your faction, and you have a certain amount of options. With our game, you can pick one of our factions, of course, and we want our gangs to be as cool as they possibly can be. And you could just make a pre-made, just grab one of the pre-made gangs, or you can grab a gang that exists and alter it a little bit to your taste. But you also have the ability to take one of our gang templates and completely make your own gang out of it. So you could take like a Flaming Skulls template, and instead of using the characters or the defaults that we have, you could say, no, I want my leader, instead of an orc, I want my leader to be a Sasquatch. I want my leader to have these options, and I don't want to have a lot of rookies. I want to have just a small amount of rookies, and I want everybody to use magic, right? So you can really customize your gang and even your individual characters in a really, really in-depth way. Now, of course, that's not for everybody, right? Not everybody wants to get that nitty-gritty with making the gang. They just want to hop in and play. And so we'll absolutely have, the standard gang lists for people who just want to hop in and play right out of the box.
Yeah.
But I also know that part of what I liked about doing competitive stuff with Warhammer, at Adepticon and those kind of things, is spending an insane amount of time like fiddling with my list and making it just so. So we want to really give the breadth of diversity between those two poles. You can just hop in and use a pre-made list, or you can spend literally as much time as you possibly can want, fiddling over the minutest detail and making your gang as customized to you as you want. The second thing that makes gangs different is we have a grit mechanic. And grit, we use poker chips to represent grit. But at the beginning of the game, each gang gets a certain amount of what we call grit. And that represents everything from pride, anger, courage. It's what keeps your gang fighting and keeps your gang from running away. When a magical cyber beast comes running at you. So when your grit runs out, your gang gets afraid and runs away. So when you lose your grit, when you get 0 grit, you lose the game. But along the way, that grit can actually be used in various ways to increase your abilities. It can help you act out of turn order. It can boost certain powers that you have. And so the grit mechanic actually makes a huge swing in the happenings of each turn. Like it can really affect the flow of a game. But if you use too much of it and you're not paying attention to the mechanics that will get you grit back, it's just going to drain you and you're going to lose the game.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are two things that I think make, and aside from the aesthetic and the amazing minis, which I think are worth it in and of themselves. But yeah,
I am sure. I definitely know there have been games or just kind of companies that I've looked at just because I've seen a nice shiny mini and I'm like, do I really need another game? But the mini's so pretty.
right.
Like, it's always a balancing act.
Yeah.
So yeah, you mentioned about how there's this really in-depth customizability, because obviously some people really like that aspect, and you referred to competitive play. So is the hope to eventually kind of cultivate a competitive scene for this game?
Yeah, absolutely. I obviously can't control, uh, who all is going to get into this game competitively. At this point, we're just focused on hopefully being able to make the game. But I really look forward to being one of those creators who offers prize support. Who can host tournaments at Adepticon, Gen Con, Origins, all the ones that I can realistically get to, and then maybe even if we can find demo agents in other places, I would love to have them run tournaments at conventions. I'd love to. One of the gold standards for me, and one of the reasons I got into Warhammer in the beginning was during the I don't know if you were playing Warhammer at all, or if you I don't know if you played Warhammer Fantasy at all. I know that you were primarily 40k. Is that right?
Yeah, I did play a little bit of fantasy, though it was during the end times itself. So I only know kind of that era of fantasy.
Yeah. So like before the end times, they had a sort of like soft end times thing.
Hmm.
It was like in the early 2000s, I think. It was sort of like a war of chaos type thing. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it was when they introduced all the new chaos models. They introduced Archaon and Crom, and all those models came out. Again, I forget the crossover name, but
Hmm.
it was this event that happened all summer, and they recorded the results from all these battles that they were happening, throughout all the local game shops, and then they were supposed to, they never actually did, but they were supposed to change the lore of the game and update the timeline based on what happened in in those battles. Now, of course, I think it went so silly. I want to say that they needed either the Empire or Chaos to win, and they weighted it heavily towards one of those winning. But I think Orcs ended up winning, and it really threw off everything. So they basically ignored that whole campaign and ignored that whole storyline, and then reworked it for the end times. When they finally got rid of things. But one of the things that really got me into it was the idea that the results of all of these battles all across the world would affect the lore in some meaningful way. And so I really want to see that kind of thing happen,
Hmm.
especially if we can get to any sort of meaningful engagement with the conventions. We have tournaments and whatnot. We'll give prize support, but also we'll keep track and change things. And yeah, I just hope with everything that we do, we want to say, like, what would we want out of this? And if we want it, if we thought it would be cool, then surely somebody else will. And that's kind of the operating goal of everything that we do.
Yeah. So to have sort of a living world that the community can help influence.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you think you go down the vein of kind of the community decides it entirely, or you write, what would happen if this faction wins, if this faction wins, if this faction wins, and it's just depending on the faction wins, that becomes the law?
I don't know. That's a good question. I know we have writers that are talented enough to probably work in whatever results we get, but I
Hmm.
imagine that we would have um, some idea of what might happen if each faction were to win. Right now, we only have two factions available, so hopefully we'll get some factions unlocked. Because even if a gang is unlocked, without necessarily the minis, that's an opportunity for, just like in Warhammer, you had certain lists that were available, but with not a lot of minis attached to them, and the community itself steps up, and the hobbyists step up and make entire lists, with models that don't exist in the range. So yeah, I
Yeah.
look forward to that too. People grabbing Reaper or Warhammer and converting them, making them cool as hell, extra gangs, and customizing their own gang. And hey, this is my gang. I look forward to that.
Yeah. So hopefully the Kickstarter is successful, and say all these gangs get unlocked and all the stretch goals are met. What is the plan for Gangs of this Undercity beyond Kickstarter? Like, do you already have in mind some maybe models or factions that would be released? Would you expand upon the existing factions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at this point we would not expand on any of the gangs that we have.
Hmm.
We would have probably 6 for each gang, that were basically just before those gangs. Of course, you can convert them and change them into whatever you want to. But I think after that, once we release the initial 6 for each gang, what we want to do is release what we're calling freebooters, which are like, I guess there'd be virtual mercenaries, right? So
Hmm.
models that kind of fill in the gaps, of species and gender and role, so that you can grab one of those and fit it into whatever theme that you have for your game. So we hope to just keep releasing freebooters that will be different and diverse enough that they'll fit into other gangs,
Yeah.
along with also having um, companion models like beasts or drones or elementals and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So going back into the universe of Gangs of the Undercity itself, what was it that made you decide to kind of set it both on Earth and only, say 20 years in the future?
Uh, that was a lot of conversation between myself and the lore team about that. I think we wanted to make things as easy as possible for people to get into. So
Yeah.
one of the things about Shadowrun that I love is that it has a deep history and a deep lore, that is as deep as you want to get into it, and it's fascinating just learning about it. And I started a whole podcast about it. But also, one of the things that can be a little intimidating is just learning all the new lingo, learning all the different things there are to learn. And
Hmm.
so I thought, you know, coming up with a cyberpunk futuristic version of any world but our own would be so incredibly difficult. Right, just like, how do you figure what a fantasy world would be like?
Yeah.
So in one sense it was just making it a little bit easier on ourselves, but I think the more than that, uh, when I was just coming up with the concept, I just had this city of Neo Babylon in my mind. Like, that name Neo Babylon just kept sticking in my head, probably because of a lot of the Middle Eastern studies that I used to do in grad school. But Neo Babylon stuck, and once I decided that Neo Babylon was going to be the city where this took place, I really couldn't justify using Neo Babylon without rooting it in the real world. And so that's kind of what we settled on, and
Yeah.
that really um, also provided us a jumping off point for how Gangs of the Undercity history diverges from real world history. And so we decided to go a different direction than the other cyberpunk fantasy universes, in that magic comes back in those universes. But for us, we decided, what if magic has always been around? How would that have affected things? And now, in the future of a world that had always had magic, how is technology changing the power dynamics? So, in our world, 2,600 years ago, the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar was the first large group to harness magical ability and to use it to wage war. And so that upset the power balance of everything, and basically, in a very short and not at all adequate way, um, replaced Babylon replaced Rome as having an undue influence over the old world. And so once we did that, we just started extrapolating everything that we could, If magic and Babylonian culture were to influence the world in the way that, say, Greco-Roman thoughts and ideas did in our world, what would that look like? And that was sort of our jumping off point.
Yeah. Awesome stuff. And I mean, if people do want to go and find out more about Gangs of the Undercity, there is obviously your website, and on YouTube you've been doing some great both kind of lore videos going over the history of the world itself, and there's also the audio drama that's recently started up as well.
Yeah, yeah. One of our team members, um, who is also a really good friend of mine. His name is Palmer, and he is really passionate about audio dramas. So he said, hey, I can't help with the. He's not a war gamer, he's just a
Hmm.
storyteller. So he says, like, what if I made this audio drama instead? I was like, oh, that's a great idea. So yeah, he's been pumping out these audio dramas that sort of provide a lead in to Gangs of the Undercity. And it's just called Undercity. And you can find that on Worlds Without End podcast, or you can go to Fragging Unicorns channel on YouTube and listen both to the lore videos that kind of catch you up on the lore behind Gangs of the Undercity, but also you can listen to the audio drama.
Yeah, it seems like you're very much putting a lot of effort into helping get the idea of the world out there rather than just going, here's Kickstarter. If you want to know anything, read the Kickstarter page. You're actually kind of, there's a lot of focus on world building over just here's some minis, we'll make the world around them make sense.
Yeah, we we have such nerdy people working on this game that we have our Discord channel, and the Discord channel is just lighting up every single day, every single hour with, hey, would this be cool? How do we do this? And then we've got people who are basically rule of cool, where I don't care how you justify it, just put that cool thing in. And you got people who on the other side are like, no, that doesn't make sense. That won't make sense. We have to explain that. That doesn't make sense. So we go back and forth, and we good naturedly argue about virtually everything in the world, so that when you get down to being able to tell stories in this world, everything makes sense and it is a fun world to play in.
Yeah. And would you say the hope is to potentially expand beyond Neo Babylon itself for the miniatures game, or is that more likely to be left towards the RPG side of things?
Yeah, the RPG is definitely not stuck in the Undercity. The the miniatures game, I imagine we will have elements from outside the Undercity make its way in, but
Hmm.
the conceit of the game of Gangs of the Undercity really only works, if it's in that Undercity setting. I can't imagine where else in the world that you would have basically such a lawless ability for gangs to completely control everything, and the cops would just say, "Nah, I'm not going to deal with that." Everywhere else in our world is a little bit more a little bit more civilized than that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, I mean, I suppose that doesn't mean that you couldn't use the Gangs of the Undercity rules, to play out certain battles and whatnot. Like, especially if you're playing the role playing game and you kind of wanted to switch into a couple of tactical battles, that would be appropriate, I think.
Yeah. Kind of a nice integration between RPG and skirmish game.
Yeah, I mean, the rules for both are they're going to be quite different. So you could, I think, play with the models of Gangs of the Undercity, with the RPG rules, on the same similar mat. Or you could, use your characters from the RPG and play with the Gangs of the Undercity rules. So you could go back and forth, but the rules themselves are going to be quite different.
Yeah. So moving kind of more away from Gangs of the Undersea, outside of, you said your project desk is filled with Gangs of the Undersea at the minute, but
Yeah,
are there kind of any other games or I guess general nerdiness that you get up to outside of this?
yeah, absolutely. I continue to play Shadowrun. I have an ongoing actual play of Shadowrun called Shadowrun Origins that we continue to put out. But also, I have, like I said, an entire garage full of miniatures, and the things that I keep in front of me that I keep wanting to paint, but I haven't had the time yet, are basically an entire shipment of creature caster miniatures. I don't know if you're familiar with those.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have 2 boxes of creature caster miniatures. Uh, big old demons and whatnot that I keep looking at. And I keep buying hobby stuff, even though I'm not painting anything. I continue to buy stuff. The Warhammer shop just opened up, pretty close to my house, so I keep going in and I keep buying stuff. But yeah, most of the time, lately, I've been building terrain for gangs, painting gangs, and playing Fortnite with my son, getting my ass kicked pretty hard. But yeah, still trying to play.
Yeah, I mean, nothing wrong with adding to the pile of shame as well. Like, it just means, if anything like this ever happens again, you're going to have plenty to sit back and work on.
Absolutely.
So with the RPG itself, would the hope to be kickstartering that as well, or does it kind of depend upon the success of Gangs of the Undercity itself as to how the RPG would become available?
No, I think we're building a pretty good model. I say that without knowing how the model is working, but I think we're building a pretty good basis for which to do the same thing with the RPG. The costs for the RPG and the logistics for it are going to be much lower. So we think that if we do well with the Kickstarter for gangs, then it probably wouldn't be. It'd probably be less than a year before we return again and try to make the same go for getting the RPG out.
Yeah.
Kickstarter.
Well, that feels like as great a place as any to end it. So thanks for talking to me today, Opti. It's been a pleasure.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to the latest episode of the Graduate Gamer Podcast. I'd once again like to thank Opti for joining me. It was an absolute pleasure to have you. Make sure to check out the links in the video description for the Gangs of the Undercity Kickstarter, which launches later today. If you liked the video and want to see more, make sure to drop a like and subscribe. And if you have any feedback, guest suggestions, or simply want to join in the conversation, make sure to drop a comment down below. Otherwise, I will see you all in the next one.